Some fairy tales are built on lies. Amelia Sterling believed she was living one. Nestled in a Fifth Avenue penthouse with a doting millionaire husband, Julian Vance, and their first child on the way. Her world was a masterpiece of curated perfection, a life she'd chosen away from her billionaire father's colossal shadow. But in the quiet moments, when the city lights glittered like scattered diamonds below, a chill would snake through the warmth of her happiness. A secret text, a lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume, a lie too smooth on her husband's tongue. Amelia was about to discover that the only thing more devastating than a shattered fairy tale is the methodical, absolute revenge orchestrated by a father whose love for his daughter knows no price and no mercy. Amelia Sterling traced the delicate hand-painted giraffes on the nursery wall, a soft smile gracing her lips. At 6 months pregnant, she had finally begun to show in a way that felt real, a gentle, promising curve that she cradled protectively. The late afternoon sun streamed through the panoramic windows of their penthouse, casting long golden shadows across the plush, cream-colored carpet. From this height, Central Park was a perfect rectangle of green, a world away from the hushed serenity of their home. Everything in her life felt meticulously arranged, a masterpiece of domestic bliss she had co-created with her husband, Julian Vance. Julian was the charismatic founder of Vance Capital, a boutique real estate development firm that was the talk of New York. He was handsome, ambitious, and possessed a charm that could disarm the most cynical of investors. To Amelia, he was the man who saw her, not Arthur Sterling's daughter. Her father, a titan of private equity whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear on Wall Street, had been skeptical of Julian at first. "New money shouts, Amelia," he had cautioned her, his voice a low rumble over dinner at the Carlyle. "Old money whispers." But Julian's ambition felt like passion to her, his drive a refreshing change from the languid, entitled airs she had grown up with. She had fallen in love with his story, the self-made man who had clawed his way to a 9-figure net worth before his 35th birthday. "It's perfect, isn't it?" Julian's voice, smooth as single malt scotch, came from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, loosening the silk tie of his Tom Ford suit. He'd just returned from the office, and the sight of him, so effortlessly elegant, still made her heart flutter. "It is," she agreed, turning to face him. "I was just thinking about names again. What do you think of Theodore? Teddy for short?" Julian crossed the room, his bespoke leather shoes making no sound on the thick rug. He kissed her forehead, his lips cool. "Strong, classic, I like it." But his eyes weren't on the nursery or on her. They flickered towards his phone, which he placed face down on the changing table. A subtle, almost imperceptible tension tightened the muscles in his jaw. It was a look she'd been seeing more and more often lately, a fleeting shadow of preoccupation that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Long day?" she asked, trying to draw him back to her, to this moment. "Brutal," he sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair. "The Hudson Yards project is hitting some zoning snags. We might need to fly out to Chicago to meet with the architects again. Maybe next week." "Chicago? Again?" A small frown creased her brow. He had been to Chicago twice in the last month. "Julian, you promised you'd cut back on travel as we got closer to my due date." "I know, my love, I know," he said, his tone placating. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. His embrace felt different lately, less an act of affection and more a gesture of containment, as if to quell her questions before they were fully formed. "This is the last push. Once we break ground, I'm all yours. And little Teddy's." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Those hazel eyes, once so open and adoring, now seemed to hold a guarded depth she couldn't penetrate. Later that evening, as they prepared for the annual Benefactors Gala at the Met, the feeling of unease returned. Julian was on a call in his study, his voice low and urgent. Amelia, fastening a diamond necklace that had been a gift from her father, caught snippets of the conversation through the slightly ajar door. "No, Chloe, that's not possible. Just handle the presentation. I'll make it up to you, I promise." Chloe. Amelia knew the name. Chloe Rivington was Julian's new senior vice president of acquisitions. He had praised her relentlessly, her brilliant Harvard MBA, her aggressive negotiation tactics, her killer instinct. Amelia had met her once at a company dinner. She was stunning, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a confidence that bordered on predatory. A pang of something ugly and unfamiliar, jealousy, pricked at Amelia's heart. She dismissed it as hormonal, a silly side effect of her pregnancy. Julian was a successful man surrounded by ambitious people, both men and women. It was the nature of his world. As they descended in the private elevator, the polished brass reflecting their glamorous image, Julian squeezed her hand. "You look radiant, Amelia, truly." He was a master of the perfect compliment at the perfect time, and for a moment, bathed in his admiration, she believed it. She allowed herself to be swept up in the fantasy once more. The handsome husband, the beautiful life, the baby on the way. The gala was a glittering sea of New York's elite. Amelia navigated the conversations with practiced grace, discussing art with trustees and philanthropy with banking scions. Julian was in his element, moving through the crowd like a shark, a charming smile fixed on his face as he networked relentlessly. Amelia found her best friend, Olivia Chen, near the Temple of Dender. Olivia, a sharp-witted journalist for a major financial paper, looked at her with knowing eyes. "You look tired," Olivia said, bypassing the usual pleasantries. "Just the baby," Amelia replied, placing a hand on her stomach. "It's not the baby," Olivia said, lowering her voice. "It's him. I saw him with Senator Thompson 5 minutes ago, and he looked like a hostage trying to negotiate his own release. He hasn't looked you in the eye for more than 3 seconds all night. What's going on?" Amelia stiffened. "Nothing is going on. He's stressed about a project." Olivia raised a skeptical eyebrow. "The Hudson Yards project? I heard through the grapevine that Vance Capital landed that deal 6 weeks ago. Smooth as silk. The zoning was pre-cleared. There are no snags, Amelia." The blood drained from Amelia's face. A simple statement, a piece of industry gossip, and suddenly the tiny cracks in her perfect world began to widen into fissures. The frequent trips to Chicago, the hushed phone calls, the name Chloe. It was a lie, a clear, calculated lie. Why? She scanned the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. She spotted Julian near the bar, laughing with a group of investors. His phone was in his hand. As she watched, he tilted the screen away from the group, a subtle, practiced movement. He typed a quick message, a small, secretive smile playing on his lips. Then he looked up, and his eyes met hers across the crowded room. The smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't name. Panic, annoyance, guilt. He immediately started walking towards her, his public smile back in place. But Amelia couldn't hear his words as he approached. All she could hear was the echo of her father's warning, a whisper from the past that was now a deafening roar in her ears. New money shouts. And in that moment, she realized Julian's entire life was a performance, a loud, desperate shout for validation. And she was beginning to suspect she was nothing more than part of the set dressing. The next few days were a masterclass in self-deception. Amelia tried to bury Olivia's words under a mountain of rationalizations. Julian was under pressure. Perhaps he was trying to protect her from some other, more complicated business stress. Men did that, didn't they? They compartmentalized. They shielded their pregnant wives from the harsh realities of the world. She wanted to believe this so badly that she almost convinced herself it was true. She focused on the nursery, on her prenatal yoga, on the steady, reassuring kicks of the baby inside her. She created a bubble of tranquility and dared the world to burst it. The bubble burst on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Julian had called to say he was stuck in back-to-back meetings and would be late. Very late. "Don't wait up for me, sweetheart," he'd said, his voice strained. Amelia had ordered in her favorite pasta and was curled up on the sofa, reading a book on infant sleep schedules, when an email notification popped up on their shared home tablet. It was from their credit card company, a fraud alert. "Unusual activity detected on your Amex Centurion card." Her brow furrowed. That was Julian's primary business card. She opened the email. The alert was for a charge made less than an hour ago. A charge for $1,285, $60 at a place she'd never heard of, La Fleur Sauvage. The name sounded like a florist. Why would Julian spend over $1,000 at a florist and have it flagged as unusual? Curiosity, sharp and insistent, overrode her hesitation. She logged into the account. The charge was there, pending, but it wasn't the amount that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the merchant category, lingerie and adult novelties. La Fleur Sauvage wasn't a flower shop. A wave of nausea, completely unrelated to her pregnancy, washed over her. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the recent transactions. There were others. Dinners for two at notoriously romantic, out-of-the-way restaurants in Brooklyn and Westchester. Places they had never been together. Hotel charges. Not for the five-star chains he used for business, but for boutique hotels like the Greenwich Hotel, always on the nights he was supposedly working late, or on one of his quick trips to Chicago. The lie about Chicago. Olivia's words came rushing back. The zoning was pre-cleared. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. The whispered calls, the name Chloe, the lingerie, the romantic dinners, the boutique hotels. It was a sordid, damning trail of breadcrumbs leading to a conclusion she could no longer ignore. Her husband, the man she was building a family with, was having an affair. The key turned in the lock just after midnight. Amelia was still on the sofa, the tablet screen dark on the cushion beside her. The book lay forgotten on the floor. She had been sitting there for hours, a cold, hollow knot in the pit of her stomach. She watched as Julian entered, shrugging off his raincoat. He looked exhausted, but it was the weariness of satiation, not stress. "Hey," he said softly, feigning surprise to find her awake. "I told you not to wait up." He walked over to kiss her, but she flinched, turning her head so his lips met her cheek. He froze, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The air in the room was thick with unspoken accusations. "What's wrong, Amelia? Is it the baby?" "The baby is fine," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I am not." He took a step back, his expression guarded. "What happened? Talk to me." "Where were you tonight, Julian?" she asked, her eyes boring into his. "I told you. Meetings. We were hammering out the final details on the financing for the merger. It was a marathon session at the firm's offices." He sounded so convincing, his brow furrowed with just the right amount of concern and fatigue. A year ago, she would have believed him without question. Tonight, every word was an insult. "Which firm?" she pressed. "Goldman, J.P. Morgan." "It was with a private consortium," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "You wouldn't know them." Amelia picked up the tablet, her movements slow and deliberate. She turned the screen on and angled it towards him. The Amex statement was still displayed, the charge from La Fleur Sauvage highlighted. "Does this private consortium specialize in French lingerie?" The color drained from Julian's face. He stared at the screen, his carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. For a moment, he was speechless, his mind visibly scrambling for an escape route, a plausible lie. He found none. His expression hardened, shifting from feigned concern to cold, reptilian anger. "You went through my credit card statements? What gives you the right to spy on me? What gives me the right?" Her voice cracked, the first sign of the heartbreak tearing through her. "I'm your wife, Julian. I'm carrying your child. I think I have the right to know if you're spending our money on another woman." "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing towards the hallway as if the staff, long since retired to their quarters, could hear them. "This isn't what it looks like." "Then what is it?" she cried, finally letting the tears fall. Tell me what a $1,200 charge at a lingerie store looks like. Tell me what secret dinners and hotel rooms look like. Tell me what your lies about Chicago look like." The fight drained out of him, replaced by a weary arrogance. He sank into an armchair opposite her, not with remorse, but with the resignation of a man who had been caught and could no longer be bothered to pretend. "All right," he said, his voice flat. "So I haven't been entirely honest with you." The understatement was so profound, so insulting, it stole her breath. "Entirely honest?" she whispered, horrified. "Amelia, you have to understand," he began, leaning forward, attempting to summon his old charm, to manage the situation. "My life is incredibly high pressure. You can't possibly know what it's like. Sometimes I need a release. It's just physical. It means nothing. It has nothing to do with you, or the baby, or what we have." Each word was a hammer blow to her heart. He wasn't just admitting it, he was justifying it. He was minimizing her pain, framing his betrayal as a necessary business expense, an unfortunate but understandable perk of his stressful life. "Who is she?" Amelia asked, the question tasting like ash in her mouth. He hesitated. "It doesn't matter." "Who is she, Julian?" she repeated, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He let out an exasperated sigh, as if she were a child asking a tiresome question. "It's Chloe Rivington, but it's not what you think. It's a complicated arrangement." Amelia stared at him, at this stranger sitting in her husband's chair. The man she loved had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating creature who spoke of his affair as a complicated arrangement. The gilded cage she had so lovingly decorated had become a prison, and the door had just slammed shut. The first crack had splintered into 1,000 pieces, and her entire world had just come crashing down around her. The days that followed the revelation were a surreal, waking nightmare. Julian, having confessed, seemed to believe the worst was over. He operated under the delusional assumption that his betrayal was a problem to be managed, a temporary crisis in their portfolio of a marriage that could be mitigated with the right strategy. He suggested therapy. He bought her a grotesquely expensive emerald bracelet from Harry Winston, which sat in its velvet box on her dresser, a cold green monument to his guilt. He was physically present, yet more emotionally distant than ever, treating her with a cloying, patronizing kindness that made her skin crawl. Amelia moved through their apartment like a ghost. The nursery she had so lovingly prepared was now a room she couldn't bear to enter. The giraffes on the wall seemed to mock her with their cheerful innocence. The truth hadn't set her free. It had trapped her in a limbo of grief and indecision. Part of her, the part that still clung to the dream of her perfect family, wanted to believe it was a mistake, a meaningless transgression he could atone for. But another colder part of her knew that the man who called his affair a complicated arrangement was not a man capable of genuine remorse. Her breaking point came a week later. Julian announced he had to go on an emergency business trip, to Boston this time, a one-night trip to secure a final piece of funding for a new development. The lie was so lazy, so insulting in its lack of creativity, that it was like a slap in the face. She knew where he was going. She knew who he was going with. "I don't want you to go," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. They were in their cavernous walk-in closet, Julian packing a leather weekender bag. "Amelia, we've been over this. It's work. It's important," he said, not looking at her as he folded a shirt with crisp, practiced movements. "Is Chloe going with you?" He paused for a fraction of a second. "She's part of the deal team, yes. It's purely professional." The cool denial, the ease with which he continued to lie to her face, solidified something within her. The grief began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She needed to see it for herself. She needed to shatter the last remaining shards of her own denial. After he left, she made a call. Not to her father, not yet. She wasn't ready for the hurricane that would unleash. She called the car service she sometimes used, the one her father's company kept on retainer, known for its absolute discretion. She asked for a driver and a car for the evening. No questions asked. She knew Julian's habits. She knew his favorite restaurant for closing dinners was a discreet, high-end Italian place in Tribeca called Il Cantinori. She had the driver park across the street in the shadows, and she waited. She felt a strange, out-of-body calm, as if she were watching a scene from a movie. Her hand rested on her stomach, a subconscious gesture of protection for the only person in this mess who was truly innocent. 2 hours later, they appeared. Julian and Chloe Rivington. They weren't walking like colleagues. His hand was resting on the small of her back, an intimate, proprietary gesture. Chloe was laughing, her head tilted back, her blonde hair catching the glow of the streetlights. They looked like a power couple, drunk on success in each other. They were so wrapped up in their own world that they didn't even glance at the black Cadillac parked just 50 feet away. Amelia watched them get into a waiting town car and drive away. She gave her driver the address Julian had given her for his Boston trip, the private airfield in Teterboro, New Jersey. The Teterboro airfield was a place of quiet, immense wealth, where private jets sat gleaming on the tarmac like sleek, predatory birds. Her driver, a stoic man named Frank, who had worked for her father for years, knew exactly which hangar to watch. Vance Capital's leased Gulfstream G650 was being prepped for departure. 10 minutes after they arrived, Julian's car pulled up directly to the jet. The door opened, and he and Chloe emerged. Under the harsh floodlights of the airfield, there was no hiding. Amelia watched as Julian pulled Chloe into his arms and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that was nothing like the chaste, perfunctory pecks he gave his wife. It was a kiss of shared secrets, of thrilling transgression. They boarded the jet, laughing, and the door sealed shut behind them. Boston. The lie was complete. Amelia didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, heavy certainty that settled in her bones. This was not a mistake. This was a parallel life he was living, a life he preferred to the one he had with her. She was not his partner. She was his collateral. Her name, her family, her father's silent backing. That was her value to him. The baby was just an extension of that collateral, another anchor to the sterling fortune. She instructed Frank to drive her back to the city. When she walked back into the silent penthouse, it no longer felt like home. It was a stage set for a life she was no longer willing to live. She went into Julian's meticulously organized office. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but her instincts guided her. She opened his laptop. It was password protected. But she remembered him once joking that his password was his life's ambition. She typed Billionaire 1. Access granted. It was all there. Emails between him and Chloe that were a sickening mix of business strategy and explicit details of their affair. They weren't just sleeping together, they were conspiring. They talked about managing Amelia, about keeping her docile and happy through the pregnancy. They discussed the Sterling connection and how to leverage it for a new fund they were planning to launch after his and Amelia's child was born, believing it would make him seem more stable, more of a family man to older, more conservative investors. The most damning file was in a folder labeled Project Legacy. It was a detailed business plan. Inside was a scheme to systematically devalue Vance Capital's existing assets while secretly acquiring prime properties through a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, with Chloe Rivington as the sole director. The plan was to orchestrate a controlled collapse of his company after siphoning off the best assets, declare bankruptcy, and then relaunch a new debt-free firm with Chloe, funded by the very investors he thought the Sterling name would help him secure. He was planning to defraud his partners, his lenders, and leave a trail of financial ruin in his wake. He wasn't just cheating on her. He was using her, her baby, and her family name as leverage in a massive fraud. The final cruelest cut was a draft of a prenuptial amendment he was planning to ask her to sign after the baby was born, citing the new complexities of their estate. It would have effectively waived her rights to any assets related to his new ventures, protecting the company he planned to build with Chloe from any future claim. Amelia closed the laptop, a glacial calm descending upon her. The heartbroken wife was gone. The woman sitting in Julian Vance's leather chair was Arthur Sterling's daughter. She took out her phone, her fingers steady. She scrolled through her contacts, past her friends, past her doctors, until she found the one name that mattered, the one name that could make this all go away. She pressed the call button. It rang once. "Amelia, is everything all right?" His voice was deep, instantly alert. He always knew when something was wrong. Amelia Sterling took a deep breath, the smell of her husband's expensive cologne lingering in the air like a final mocking insult. "Dad," she said, her voice clear and cold as ice, "I need you to come home. I need to tell you what Julian has done." Arthur Sterling arrived not in a chauffeured town car, but in the discreet armored Rolls-Royce Cullinan he used for moments that required both speed and security. It was 3 a.m, but he looked as if he'd just stepped out of a boardroom meeting, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair impeccably neat. Only the grim set of his jaw betrayed the urgency of his daughter's call. He entered the penthouse using his own key, his presence immediately commanding the vast empty space. He found Amelia in the living room, a single lamp casting a soft glow on her pale face. She was wrapped in a cashmere throw, but a deep, unshakable chill radiated from her. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked over to her, his movements economical and precise, and enveloped her in a hug. It was not a soft, comforting embrace. It was a hug of fortification, of solid, unyielding support. It said, "I am here. The ground beneath your feet is now stable." "Tell me everything," he said, his voice a low rumble. "From the beginning. Omit nothing." For the next hour, Amelia spoke. She laid out the entire sordid story with a clarity that surprised even herself. The lies about Chicago, the credit card statements, the confrontation, the trip to Teterboro, and finally the contents of the laptop. She explained the affair, the deception, and the massive fraud Julian was planning. She did not cry. Her voice was steady, infused with the cold fury of absolute betrayal. She was not a victim reporting a crime. She was an intelligence officer delivering a battlefield assessment. Arthur listened without interruption. His face was like granite, his eyes the color of a winter sky, revealing nothing. He was famous for his poker face, a countenance that had unnerved corporate raiders and foreign dignitaries alike. But as Amelia detailed the plan to use her and his unborn grandchild as leverage, a dangerous light flickered in the depths of his gaze. It was the look of a predator that has just seen its offspring threatened. When she finished, the silence in the room was heavy and profound. Arthur stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the sleeping city. For a long moment he said nothing, his hands clasped behind his back. "The prenuptial agreement I insisted upon is ironclad," he said finally, his voice calm, almost detached. "He cannot touch your personal assets or your inheritance. He cannot touch any of the trusts established for the child." He knew this. This Project Legacy was his attempt to build his own kingdom on the perception of my family's stability. He turned back to face her. "The first priority is you and the baby. Marcus is arranging for your things to be moved to the house in Greenwich tomorrow. You will be more comfortable there, more secure." Marcus Thorne was Arthur's right-hand man, a former MI6 officer who was now the head of his personal security and corporate intelligence. Marcus was a specter, a man who solved problems before most people even knew they existed. A call to Marcus meant the situation had escalated from personal to operational. "What are you going to do?" Amelia asked, though she already knew the answer. She wasn't asking if he would act, but how. Arthur's expression shifted. The concerned father receded, and the ruthless architect of global finance emerged. "A man who builds his house on a foundation of lies will find it offers no shelter in a storm," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Julian Vance wanted to play in the big leagues. He wanted to leverage the sterling name. Well, he is about to discover the full weight of that name. He took out his phone. It was a simple, old-fashioned device with no apps and no camera, encrypted to a level that was probably illegal. He dialed a number. "Marcus," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet losing none of its authority. "We have a situation. A full-spectrum offensive is required. Codename, Legacy Annulment." He paused, listening. "The target is Julian Vance and his entity, Vance Capital. I want his financial and social infrastructure dismantled. Completely. I want every partner, every lender, every investor he has ever had. I want their histories, their pressure points, their vulnerabilities. I want to know who they owe, who they fear, and who they trust." Another pause. "Engage our contacts at the SEC and the New York Attorney General's office. Anonymously, of course. Feed them the details on Project Legacy. Use the Cayman Shell Corporation as the starting point. They'll be able to unravel the rest. I want him buried in so much litigation he forgets what the sun looks like." He walked towards the bar, pouring himself a small glass of water. "Socially, he is to be rendered a pariah. I want our people on the boards of every club, charity, and co-op he is a part of. We will invoke moral turpitude clauses. We will ensure every door that was ever opened for him is slammed shut and bolted. His name is to become poison in this city." He took a sip of water, his eyes cold and hard. His accomplice, Chloe Rivington. Find out her ambition. What does she want most? A board seat? A partnership? Find it and make sure it is the one thing she can never, ever have. Let her know this is the consequence of her choices. And Marcus, I want this to be silent. I want him to feel the ground crumbling beneath his feet, but I don't want him to see the hand that is causing the earthquake. Not until the very end. He is to be bled dry, slowly. He listened for a final moment. Excellent. Begin immediately. He ended the call and placed the phone on the counter. He looked at Amelia, his expression softening once more. He will have nothing, Arthur said. The promise as solid and unbreakable as a vault at Fort Knox. By the time I am finished, the name Julian Vance will be a cautionary tale whispered by junior analysts. He will be a ghost on Wall Street. You and my grandchild will be safe, and you will never have to see or hear from him again. Amelia finally let out the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It wasn't the promise of revenge that brought her a sense of relief, but the promise of protection. The world, which had felt so terrifying and unstable just hours before, was back on its axis. The lion had awakened, and for Julian Vance, the storm was coming. Julian Vance returned from his Boston trip feeling invincible. The deal had been a success, and the night with Chloe had been an intoxicating blend of business and pleasure. He walked into his gleaming office at Vance Capital, ready to conquer the world. He envisioned his future, a new, leaner, more powerful company, free from the entanglements of his current partners, with Chloe by his side and the Sterling Vance heir providing a veneer of dynastic legitimacy. He felt a fleeting pang of guilt about Amelia, but he quickly suppressed it. She was naive, he told himself. She would be sad for a while, but she and the baby would be comfortable. It was for the best. The first sign that something was wrong was a phone call a week later. It was from Kenji Tanaka, a conservative Japanese investor who had committed $50 million to Julian's Hudson Yards project. Julian-san, Tanaka said, his voice strained, I must regretfully withdraw my commitment. There has been a portfolio realignment. A realignment? Julian balked. Kenji, we have a signed letter of intent. We're set to close next week. Circumstances have changed. My apologies, Tanaka said, and the line went dead. Julian slammed the phone down. $50 million. Gone. It was a blow, but he told himself it was survivable. He'd find another investor. But the next day, two of his primary lenders called, citing a review of their high-risk real estate exposure. They were tightening his credit lines. Suddenly, his operating capital was squeezed. Projects that were running smoothly were now facing potential delays. He started making calls, trying to raise capital, but doors that were once wide open were now mysteriously closed. Old friends and business associates were suddenly unavailable, stuck in meetings or traveling indefinitely. A chill of unease began to creep up his spine. This felt coordinated. It felt personal. Meanwhile, Chloe Rivington was facing her own problems. She had been headhunted for a coveted partnership at Apollo Global Management, the pinnacle of her ambitions. Her final interview was a mere formality. Then 2 days before the meeting, she received a curt email. The offer was rescinded. No explanation was given. When she tried to call her contact, he didn't pick up. She was mystified, then panicked. It made no sense. Julian, consumed by his own mounting problems, barely registered her distress. He was in full-blown crisis mode. Then came the letter. It was from the Securities and Exchange Commission, an official inquiry into the financial structures of Vance Capital, specifically regarding offshore entities and asset transfers. The letter mentioned an anonymous tip. Julian's blood ran cold. The Cayman Shell Corporation, the centerpiece of Project Legacy. Someone knew. But who? How? He stormed into Chloe's office and threw the letter on her desk. Did you talk to anyone? Anyone at all? Of course not, she shot back, her own composure frayed. Do you think I'm an idiot? Someone is targeting us, Julian. This isn't just bad luck. He spent the next few weeks in a frantic, paranoid daze. He hired a forensic accounting firm to handle the SEC inquiry and a private investigator to find out who was behind the attacks. But it was like fighting a ghost. The investor who pulled out, he'd simply moved his money into municipal bonds. The banks tightening credit? They were doing it across the board, they claimed. There was no clear enemy, no single source he could point to. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The financial garrote was tightening, slowly, methodically, choking the life out of his company. Unseen by Julian, the architect of his demise was receiving daily updates in a quiet sunlit study in Greenwich, Connecticut. Marcus Thorne stood before Arthur Sterling, delivering his report with crisp military precision. Tanaka-san was receptive, Marcus said. We reminded him of the favor you did for his father during the '97 Asian financial crisis. His loyalty, it seems, is to your family, not to Vance's promises of high returns. The credit lines were easier. A quiet word with the chairman of the board at both banks was sufficient. They value their relationship with Sterling Industries far more than their book of business with Vance. Arthur nodded, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. And the SEC? The package was delivered to the head of enforcement. We made sure the data on the Cayman entity was irrefutable. They've assigned a senior team. Vance will be buried in depositions and audits for at least 2 years. By the time they're done, his reputation will be in ashes. What of the accomplice, Ms. Rivington? A thin smile touched Marcus's lips. Her dream job at Apollo. The chairman of their board, Sir Reginald Hargreaves, is an old friend of yours from your London days. It seems Sir Reginald has a very strict policy against hiring individuals with questionable ethical judgment. Her name is now permanently flagged in the systems of every major executive search firm on the planet. Her career on Wall Street is over. Arthur looked out the window at Amelia, who was sitting on a garden bench reading. The color was returning to her cheeks. The haunted look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet strength. He could see the gentle curve of her belly under her linen dress. Vance's private investigator, Arthur said, turning back to Marcus. Is he any good? He's competent. He's currently chasing a dead-end lead we planted that points to a rival developer, a man named Peterson. Vance is now convinced Peterson is behind this, which is consuming his remaining resources and attention. He is fighting a war on the wrong front. Good, Arthur said. Let him exhaust himself chasing shadows. I want him to feel the full measure of his powerlessness. I want him to understand what it means to threaten my family. The final blow to Julian's financial empire came a month later. Due to the SEC investigation and the credit crunch, he was forced to default on a major loan. The default triggered a cross-collateralization clause in all his agreements. His entire portfolio was at risk. His company was insolvent. Vance Capital, the symbol of his self-made success, was bankrupt. Julian sat in his office, the lights of New York glittering mockingly outside his window. The space felt like a tomb. His lawyers had just left, their faces grim. It was over. He had lost everything. He still couldn't understand how it had happened so quickly, so completely. It was like a force of nature had risen up and wiped him off the map. He thought of Peterson, his supposed rival, with burning hatred. Then his private line rang. He picked it up. Hello, Julian. The voice was calm, familiar, and colder than a glacier. Julian froze. It was Arthur Sterling. Mr. Sterling, he stammered. I hear you've had some business troubles, Arthur said, the mock sympathy in his tone more terrifying than any threat. A terrible run of bad luck, it seems. And in that moment, Julian understood. It wasn't Peterson. It wasn't bad luck. It was the quiet, terrifyingly efficient power he had tried to leverage. It was the whisper, not the shout. It was you, Julian whispered, the realization dawning with sickening horror. All of it. You built your house on my daughter's heart, Julian, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. You planned to use my grandchild as a cornerstone for an empire of fraud. Did you really think I would let that stand? This isn't the end of your punishment. This is just the end of your wealth. The rest of your life will be the interest payment on the debt you owe my family. The line went dead, leaving Julian in a silence that was more profound than any noise. The financial garrote had done its work. He was ruined, and he was just beginning to realize that his nightmare was far from over. For Julian Vance, bankruptcy was a brutal, tangible loss. It was the seizure of assets, the liquidation of his company, the humiliating meetings with creditors. But in the rarefied air of Manhattan's elite, financial ruin was only the prelude. The true death sentence was social exile. Arthur Sterling, having methodically dismantled Julian's wealth, now set about erasing his very existence from the world he so desperately craved to be a part of. The opening salvo was fired in print. Olivia Chen, Amelia's loyal friend, published a meticulously researched expose in the Wall Street Journal. It didn't mention Arthur Sterling's name once. Instead, it was a masterful piece of financial journalism, detailing the spectacular and mysterious collapse of Vance Capital. Citing anonymous but impeccably placed sources, the article laid bare the questionable offshore accounting practices and the ethically dubious asset shuffling that had led to the company's downfall. It painted a picture of a reckless, arrogant founder whose ambition had far outstripped his integrity. Tucked into the final paragraphs was a devastatingly personal detail. It noted that the collapse coincided with Vance's acrimonious separation from his pregnant wife, Amelia Sterling, and mentioned his notably close relationship with a recently terminated senior vice president, Chloe Rivington. The implication was clear, delivered with the subtlety of a surgeon's scalpel. Julian Vance was not just a failed businessman, he was a morally bankrupt man. The article was a neutron bomb. It vaporized Julian's reputation while leaving the building standing. The day it was published, his phone, which had already grown quiet, fell completely silent. The few allies he thought he had left now saw him as radioactive. To be associated with Julian Vance was to be associated with failure, scandal, and worst of all, the unspoken wrath of Arthur Sterling. Everyone in their circle could read between the lines. This was not a random corporate implosion. This was a public execution. The social fallout was swift and merciless. An email arrived from the board of the prestigious Oak Ridge Country Club, informing him that his membership was being revoked, effective immediately under a rarely used moral turpitude clause. A week later, his name was quietly removed from the junior board of the New York Public Library, a position he had coveted as a mark of his arrival in the city's philanthropic scene. The invitation to the upcoming winter ball, the pinnacle of the social calendar, was formally rescinded. The excuse was a clerical error. He tried to fight it. He showed up at a charity auction for which he still held a ticket. As he walked in, a wave of silence followed him. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned away. The host, a man who had been clapping Julian on the back and calling him a visionary just months before, approached him with a pained expression. "Julian," he said, his voice low, "I think it would be best for everyone if you left." The public humiliation was absolute. Chloe Rivington, already a professional outcast, found herself socially excommunicated as well. Her name, linked to Julian's in the article, was now toxic. Friends stopped returning her calls. The workout classes she attended at the exclusive Tracy Anderson studio suddenly felt unwelcoming, the other women turning their backs on her in the locker room. She was branded as the other woman, the home wrecker, the fool who had hitched her wagon to a falling star. Within a month, she packed her bags and moved back to her parents' home in Ohio, her glittering New York career and social life in tatters. The final, most symbolic blow came with the sale of the penthouse. As part of the bankruptcy proceedings, it was put on the market. Julian was forced to endure the indignity of having his former life appraised and photographed for glossy real estate brochures. He had hoped for a bidding war, a chance to salvage some scrap of his former net worth from the wreckage. But the sale was strangely, unnervingly quiet. Brokers reported that potential buyers would schedule viewings, only to cancel at the last minute. The Sterling name was never mentioned, but its shadow loomed over the property. No one in New York with that kind of money was foolish enough to buy a property so clearly tainted by the silent disapproval of Arthur Sterling. After 3 months on the market, with Julian's creditors growing more impatient by the day, a single lowball offer was made. It was from a discreet LLC registered in Delaware. The offer was for less than half the apartment's appraised value, a take-it-or-leave-it proposition that the bankruptcy court, desperate to close the books, forced Julian to accept. 2 weeks after the sale closed, Amelia received a small, velvet-lined box from her father. Inside was a single key. "I thought you might want the nursery furniture," the attached note read. The Delaware LLC, of course, belonged to Arthur Sterling. He hadn't just bankrupted the man who had hurt his daughter. He had bought the very stage on which the betrayal had taken place, just to have the satisfaction of turning off the lights. Julian Vance was now a ghost in a city that feasts on success and has no memory for failure. He had lost his company, his wife, his reputation, and his home. He had no friends, no prospects, and no future. He would see people he once knew on the street, and they would look straight through him, their eyes gliding over him as if he were nothing more than a crack in the pavement. The shout of his new money had been silenced, replaced by an eternal, damning whisper of who he had dared to cross. Arthur Sterling's revenge was complete. Julian Vance had not just been defeated, he had been erased. The crisp autumn air of Greenwich was a world away from the recycled chill of a Manhattan penthouse. Amelia sat on a sprawling lawn that sloped gently down towards the calm, gray waters of the Long Island Sound. The leaves on the ancient oak trees that dotted the Sterling estate were turning brilliant shades of crimson and gold. In her arms, nestled in a soft blue blanket, slept Theodore Arthur Sterling. Teddy. He was 2 months old, a perfect, beautiful fusion of hope and innocence. He had his mother's deep blue eyes and, she thought with a private smile, his grandfather's determined chin. The past few months had been a period of quiet healing. Her father had created a sanctuary for her, a fortress of tranquility where the chaos of her old life could not penetrate. The news of Julian's spectacular downfall had reached her, of course. Olivia had kept her apprised, framing it as a series of well-deserved consequences rather than a vengeful plot. Amelia felt no triumph, no satisfaction in his ruin. What she felt was a profound and cleansing sense of detachment. Julian Vance was a character from a book she had once read, a life she had once lived that no longer felt like her own. His destruction was not her victory. Her victory was Teddy, sleeping peacefully in her arms. Arthur Sterling emerged from the stone house, a rare, gentle smile on his face. He had changed since Teddy's birth. The ruthless corporate titan was still there, but now he made time for things he hadn't in decades. He would sit for an hour, just watching the baby sleep. He read financial reports with Teddy nestled on his chest, one hand on the papers, the other gently patting his grandson's back. "Marcus just called with the final disposition," he said, his voice soft so as not to wake the baby. He sat in the Adirondack chair next to her. "The final disposition?" Amelia asked, her eyes not leaving her son's face. "Of Vance Capital's assets," Arthur clarified. "The bankruptcy auction was today. An investment group acquired the company's remaining portfolio for pennies on the dollar." "And," she prompted, knowing there was more. "The investment group is a subsidiary of Sterling Industries," he said, a glint of satisfaction in his eye. "I bought his entire bankrupt company. We're liquidating everything. The Hudson Yards project, which he saw as his masterpiece, will be bulldozed and turned into a public park. We'll dedicate it to the city. It will be a beautiful green space." It was the final devastating act of erasure. Not only had he ruined Julian, he had bought the remnants of his legacy just to salt the earth where it had once stood. It was an act of such total, absolute power that it was almost biblical. "And him?" Amelia asked, her voice a whisper. "What will happen to him now?" "He has nothing left," Arthur said simply. "The legal fees from the SEC investigation have consumed what little he received from the penthouse sale. He's facing probable indictment. He is, for all intents and purposes, a non-entity. He has accepted a job selling commercial insurance in a suburb of Cleveland. It is a fitting end. A man who dealt in skyscrapers will now deal in policies for strip malls." Cleveland. It seemed a million miles away. A different universe. Amelia looked at her son, at his tiny, perfect fingers curled around hers. Julian had wanted a legacy, a dynasty. He had tried to build it on a foundation of lies and deceit. But this tiny, breathing soul in her arms was a true legacy. It was a legacy of survival, of strength, of a family's unbreakable love. "Thank you, Dad," she said, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were clear and bright. "Thank you for protecting us." "Always," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. He reached out and gently stroked Teddy's head. "He hurt my family. There is no forgiveness for that." The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. A new dawn was breaking for Amelia Sterling. She was not the naive girl who had been swept off her feet by a charming fraud. She was a mother. She was a survivor. And she was, and always had been, a Sterling. She had stepped out of the gilded cage and into the clean open air of a future she would build herself, for herself and for the tiny precious boy who was her entire world. The revenge was over, but for Amelia and her son, life was just beginning. And so the empire Julian Vance built on lies was turned to dust, not by a market crash, but by the quiet, unstoppable force of a father's love. Amelia's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about the astonishing strength that can be forged in the fires of heartbreak. It's a testament to the fact that true power isn't about shouting your success from the rooftops, but about having the unshakable foundation of family to catch you when you fall. Her journey from a shattered fairy tale to a new dawn of independence and motherhood is a powerful reminder that our greatest victories often rise from the ashes of our deepest wounds. If you were moved by Amelia's journey to reclaim her life and the lengths her father went to for justice, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable tales of drama, resilience, and sweet, sweet revenge.